making a lidded box, or how this became this. Let's take a look at the layers in this box. We have a top and a bottom, and the top is made out of padauk, that's the reddish wood on the outside, and then a strip of cherry in the middle. The padauk that I had wasn't quite wide enough to make the top and the bottom, so I laminated it together with a piece of cherry. Cherry often has a little reddish hue, and I thought it would complement the padauk pretty nicely. Now we have two outer rings, and these rings are made up of bubinga and maple. Bubinga and maple contrast very nicely in terms of color, and they also turn very well. There's one inner ring, and that inner ring is also made of bubinga and maple. Now let's start at the bottom, and the first thing that we have to do is we have to glue the bottom onto a block so that we can attach it to a faceplate, and that way we have our box securely fastened to the headstock, which is where the power comes to turn the lathe. Now to glue on the bottom to the block, I'm going to press it with a reverse chuck adapter, and that's a pretty cool little tool. Doesn't exist actually for my size lathe, but I have a student who has a brother who has a machine shop, and he graciously made me a piece for my lathe that serves a number of purposes. But one thing I can do is attach a faceplate and a block to it so that I can press layers together when I'm gluing things up on the lathe. Well, once the bottom is in place, it's time to add our rings one at a time. So I'm going to use a centering jig to make sure that this ring gets as precisely on center as possible. Now again, I don't have this tool actually, so I just put together a couple of pieces. There's a block of wood that is turned down to the precise inside diameter of my ring, and that I attach to my chuck. The chuck you usually use on the other end of the lathe to hold material while you're turning it. And of course my chuck is attached to my reverse chuck adapter that goes into the tailstock. So a nice little gizmo that I made to help me have precision in centering my rings. And then of course I just glue the ring onto the bottom by the use of wood clamps. If you think these wood clamps look old, they are. I don't know how old they are, but I do remember using them as a kid when working in my dad's wood shop, and these things work as well now as they did then. So once we've added that ring, we have to face the ring. We have to turn the front of that ring to make sure that it's perpendicular to the bottom, and you'll see that there's glue in between the segments of the ring. That'll all get turned away. So we have to smooth off the face of that ring so that it will be ready to accept the next ring. Well, once it's faced off, then I turn the inside. I find it easier when making segmented bowls and boxes to turn the inside of each ring as I go. Now we're just going to repeat the process by adding the second ring on top of the first ring. And you'll notice that this ring is going to be offset. I'm not going to line my corners up. Rather, I'm going to put the center of one of my segments right at the joint of my previous ring. This is actually a compound ring. I glued up a piece of bubinga and a piece of maple to make this ring. Once that long strip was glued up, I then cut my segments, but when I glued the segments up, I flipped them so that you'd get that reverse effect and you see that small offset, just to add a little bit of design interest to the piece. Now it's time to face off that second ring and also to turn the inside so that it matches the inside ring. Now it looks like there are 3 rings there, but remember that center ring that we just put on is actually a lamination of maple and a thin piece of bubinga. Time to add the third ring, and we've got to make sure that we align this ring with the first ring so that when we're done, our lines match up perfectly. So we've got to make sure that we have a nice alignment, and this I do primarily by eye. Now that the third ring is on, we have to face it off so that it's ready to receive the top, and we turn the inside so that the inside matches the previous two rings. Time now to add the top, and here we see the top glued on, and I used that same reverse chuck adapter and the press to press that on while the glue dried. I also wanted to make sure that this top was lined properly, so I struck a couple of lines that match up with the cherry on the bottom so that the cherry for the top would line up with the cherry of the bottom. Later on I'm going to have to part this off, but I glue the top on so that I can turn it to the exact outside dimension of the rest of the box. But before we part off the top, it's time to finish the outside. And I do that with sanding. I sand through grits starting at about an 80 grit and then working my way up to actually about 2000, which is pretty fine. And you can actually see a sheen on that wood. There's no finish on this wood yet. That's just the sheen that's created by the use of very fine sandpaper. I also have a small block protecting the top so that I don't put any kind of mark in it. I pull the tailstock up to the top to help hold the piece while I'm sanding it. And the live center on the tailstock actually has a little point on it, and I don't want that point to go into the top, so I put this little piece of oak in there to protect the top while sanding the side. But when it comes to sanding the top, I've got to pull the tailstock away, obviously, and I take it through those same grits to match it up as well. I didn't mention this, but while I'm doing this sanding, the lathe is running, so that box is spinning at probably around 1800 RPMs. Now we're ready to part off the top. And I just use a parting tool to do that. It's like a thin knife. The box spins, you put the turning knife in, and you cut that top off. Once it's parted off, you're going to need to clean up. There's going to be some leftover, so I'll have to sand this to get it nice and clean. And the way I'll do that is by using a disc sander that I've made. It's a 12-inch self-adhesive piece of sandpaper that's a circle. So I have a 12-inch piece of plywood attached to a faceplate attached to the headstock. That spins, and by hand I hold that top up to clean it up, make it nice and flat. But of course I'm going to have to do some hand sanding on this because I don't have all of those grits in order to take this all the way down to 2000. So I'm going to use hand sandpaper to sand the bottom of the top. Well, once that's done, now I have to finish the bottom of the box because I had to part it off of that original glue block, and I'm going to use coal jaws to do that. You can see those little black tips on the coal jaws, and those jaws go in and they go out, and so you can grab something that's finished already by having those black tips squeeze into the outside or expand out on the inside. And what I'm doing on this is I'm using it in the expansion mode, so I expand those jaws so that those black tips grab the inside of the box, and then the box is secure for me to be able to finish off the bottom. And I'm going to use a lathe knife to make the bottom a little bit concave, and that prevents a box like this from rocking when it sits on a table, because you're not possibly going to be sitting on the bottom center. You're going to be sitting on a slight rim that you've actually created through that concave pattern on the bottom. And then of course after it's turned, it has to be finished with sandpaper, and you're looking at the finished product right there. Now we have to add some kind of catches to attach the lid to the box. And there are a number of ways of doing this, and I'm doing something here that I've never tried before. I'm going to be using magnetic catches. These are actually small super magnets, and I saw this on a box on Pinterest, and I thought it'd be an interesting way to try to attach it. So I drill a couple of very small flat bottom holes that are going to take those magnets. And then I'll actually use something like super glue to glue those magnets in. So I use what's called CA glue, and it's kind of an industrial quality super glue. And I put the magnets into the bottom of the lid, and then in a corresponding hole in the edge of the box, I put some special nails that I found that have a very smooth finish. And that way I'm going to have a magnetic catch that will hold the lid onto the box. Time now for finishing. One of my favorite finishes is Danish oil. It not only produces a nice finished coat, but it's pretty easy to use. And so I'm going to be finishing this by hand. This is the first of 3 coats of Danish oil. Once those 3 coats are dried, we're ready for the buffer. And I use the Beal buffing system. I start with a brown Tripoli, which is an abrasive. It's kind of like a rubbing compound if you want to take the old wax off of your car before you wax it. And then I go to a white diamond abrasive. It's also like a rubbing compound, but it's much, much finer. And then I use carnauba wax for the outside, and that's the final finish. So there you have it. The basic steps that I use in turning a segmented project of any kind, in this particular case, making a lidded box. This one was a lot of fun to make. It was a challenge. I was learning some new steps and some new techniques, and I was also learning in particular some new ways to try to get precision in all of my alignment. Really happy with the way this one came out. So lots of fun.